Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the topic of philosophical midwifery. And with me is the author of the book, Philosophical Midwifery, A New Paradigm for Understanding Human Problems, Dr. Pierre Grimes, who is the founder of the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, is also the founder of the Noetic Society, based in Los Angeles. He is the author of a number of other books, The Pocket Pierre, and Unblocking, which is based on the principles of philosophical midwifery. It's a practice akin to psychotherapy that takes place within a philosophical milieu. Welcome, Pierre.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure once again to be with you. So I guess one could say a philosophical practitioner, such as yourself, is something of a hybrid between a philosopher and a psychotherapist.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct.
And you've been engaged in this practice now for a good 30 years.
Well, it started in 1961 with a publication I did called Alcibiades.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a dialogue I wrote featuring Socrates and Alcibiades, who I characterized as an alcoholic. And therefore I explored Alcibiades' alcoholic addiction, alcoholism, in terms of the roots of how he came to be an alcoholic. And I wrote it up as a dialogue, and I sent it to Yale Journal. They had a journal at that time studying alcoholism. And they were very upset. They wrote me a letter and they said it caused a great deal of difficulty among the editorial board, so they sent it to another magazine. And the same thing happened there. And so they sent it back to Yale and they said, please print it. So that's how it got printed.
Okay.
So it started, therefore, as an exploration of midwifery.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been since 1960. So that's a little more than...
It's half a century.
Half a century.
Yeah. A little over half a century, to be specific. Well, how did you arrive at a term like midwifery? I know there's a history there.
Okay. See, I was involved in the study of Plato and classic thought for some time. And I had been studying dialogues, trying to understand the dynamics of a dialogue. And I was going to graduate school in San Francisco. This was in 1954.
Okay.
And I needed a job. I had a wife and several children, and unfortunately, you need to eat.
Yeah.
So I was never given enough money to live like a gentleman, so I decided I would be having to find work.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the Public Welfare Department in San Francisco, and they said, yeah, we'll hire you if you want to take a job working with alcoholics on Skid Row. I said, I'll do that. I had some people that were alcoholics in my family.
Mm.
And so I became a social worker working with alcoholics. Then they started a rehabilitation center in Redwood City after only just a few months. And since I was the only one who was working specifically with alcoholics in Skid Row, they said, you go.
Mm.
So I became the social worker, identified as the counselor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would just be at the center, and I'd say to with my alcoholics, tell me about your last drunk, and we'd chart it out on the blackboards.
Yeah.
That's all we did. I said, I want to understand you guys. I don't understand the drunk.
Mm-hmm.
So I started working with chronic alcoholics. They came back periodically. And I began seeing patterns, or didn't understand why the patterns existed. When they got a drunk and when they came off it, drunk became significant. So I had this PhD chemist, and he was a chronic alcoholic, periodic alcoholic, and we used to have great meetings. He'd come back and back.
Mm-hmm.
So one day we had charted out his pattern. We were saying, well, now why are you going through this same thing? Notice you seem to start just after you've had close to a victory, and you end up in a hospital. What's going on? It's the same thing.
Yeah. He said, self-sabotage.
Yes, sabotaging himself.
Yeah.
He said, this may not be important. He said, but I keep getting this image, an old image of, I said, well, go ahead, talk about it. He said, my mother used to come out to me, and he said, when I was a kid, we used to play football out. And of course, in those days, we didn't have uniforms or anything like that. We just play in the dirt. And it was somewhat dangerous. And my mother, she stood there by the doorway and she'd say, son, I want you to come home either with your shield or without it. They were Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
That was the old Spartan slogan. He said, I think that's what I'm doing. He said, after every drunk, I'm being carried home on a stretcher. I'm coming home on my shield. I said, yeah, but what do you make of your mother? He said, no. He said, this is rather curious. He said, but she was very busy. We had a lot of children. She said, those were the moments she appeared most beautiful to me and caring. Matter of fact, that was the only time I really got that much attention from her at that moment. I said, oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of that? He said, well, that's love. That's caring.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reenacting that moment, that great moment. I'm acting it out again and again.
Yeah.
I said, that's remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
That became the beginning of philosophical midwifery. You see.
But the term midwifery,
right.
I mean, the midwife assists in a birth.
Right.
And I gather that the philosopher who is a midwife is giving birth to the soul.
Yes. And this is what this is, giving birth to the soul.
Yeah.
But I was also into Proclus in those days.
Yeah.
And Proclus calls Socrates a midwife.
Mm-hmm.
He said, this is midwifery.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, that's what I'm doing. I'm a midwife.
Yeah.
So that's where the term philosophical midwifery came out of.
Uh-huh.
And then when I worked out the details of it, of course, then I then discovered it was the same dynamics that occurred in Homer's Iliad.
Mm.
But I chose it because...
I should just mention
yes,
that we discussed this in a previous interview, the story of how Achilles came to a realization of his own patterns and therefore was willing finally to enter into battle after he had withdrawn.
Yes.
So that's the reference to the Iliad.
Yes.
And if people want more detail on that, I will post a link to that interview.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And from that, I did this dialogue I called Alcibiades, and it got published.
Mm-hmm.
And then I didn't realize the significance of it, the implications of it for several years. And I said to myself, Pierre, maybe you're a psychologist. Maybe you're really a psychologist. You're really not a philosopher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I said, I better start over. So I packed up the family in San Francisco after I got my degrees. And I said, I think I'm going to study psychology at the New School of Research in New York City. Mm-hmm. So I joined them.
Yeah.
And what I found there was a disaster. I found that they didn't know what they were doing. We were studying, at that time, the Minnesota Symposium of Motivations, and they had a classic example we spent our time studying, and it was a number of parachuters. They were volunteers. They were all wired up on all kinds of electronic devices in order to test the level of anxiety. And we were into Dollard and the other guy's name.
Miller and Dollard.
Miller and Dollard.
Yes.
And they had the gradient where you should watch the curve of anxiety, withdrawal, and escape, approach and avoidance.
Yes, yes.
And
reminds me very much already of my first encounter with clinical psychology and behaviorism.
Good.
I had a job fresh out of college at a place called the Singer Zone Center in Rockford, Illinois. Prided itself on being 10 years ahead of the times. And I lasted 6 weeks, so.
Oh, well then we're similar, because what happened is the parachutists, by every indication, they were wired in all variety of ways. Their level of anxiety said escape. But they continued up the ladder into the plane and jumped. I said, gentlemen, your theory is false. They should have withdrawn. They should not have gotten on the plane. What are you teaching? They said, oh, no, this is a good study. I said, of course it's a good study. It shows that your theories are false. Well, that ended my career at the New School of Social Research. I decided the best thing to do is to look for a teaching job doing philosophy, and I'd spend my time doing philosophy.
Well, I understand exactly where you're coming from, because one might naively assume, especially with a background in philosophy, that psychologists are interested in the psyche. And it turns out they're not.
They're not. That's right. You see, I went under that assumption, and I found out they got very bitter. They got upset at my views. I said, well, gentlemen, I might as well leave.
They want to claim the name psyche in their name psychology, but they really don't want to have anything to do with it, except recently. Now they're beginning to look at the psyche, but for the most part, they prefer to be thought of as behavioral scientists.
You know, that's very sad.
Yeah.
And it's true. They started aping
physics,
Newtonian physics, and empirical methods. And the psyche is not in that realm. The psyche is in the realm of the mind. And so I decided, well, the best thing to do is do my own studies and continue. So I got a position in Southern California, and I started exploring problems, and out of that came a club. We started a club, and then the school got upset with having a club, so we moved off the campus and started the Noetic Society, and that's how it began.
But the basic idea, as I gather, is that you use the Socratic method in order to uncover what you call the pathologos, meaning false ideas we have about ourselves. And when people are conscious of what had previously been unconscious with regard to their very being, then there's some movement.
Yeah, there's growth. There's development. See, then the stage came when I was looking then at the need to explore daydreams. Now, daydreams are the same thing, except for one factor. There are 5 kinds of daydreams. I like the tangent daydreams. When anyone is involved in something that takes their attention and their focus of their energies, and they need to devote themselves very carefully to the content of something, especially in intellectual work, anything that interrupts that is a tangent. That tangent is likely to contain an image of themselves or a daydream. My goal then is to get people to write down their daydream and only ask a few questions, such as, describe the first moment you had the daydream where you have an image of yourself.
Oh.
Examine yourself. I don't need to examine your daydream. You can examine the daydream yourself and see that what is implicit in that image is the drama of the daydream. What's significant is when you allow it to go its full course, you wake up to recognize it's false because it's a failure. There are always failures in tangent daydreams.
Oh.
I said, now look here. Why is it you identified, therefore, with the false image of yourself? You don't realize that that is your false image of yourself, because you identify with it immediately when it occurs. You allow it to play itself out.
Yeah.
Therefore, now that we know we now can identify your false image of the self, let's see if we can discover its origin.
Now, why is a daydream necessarily a false image? Couldn't it also be simply the mind scanning for potential problems so that they can be avoided?
That might be, but that's not a tangent daydream.
Okay.
There can be other kinds of daydreams, and that is true.
I see.
But tangent daydreams, you see, you're pursuing something you love.
Yeah.
You're pursuing, anytime you pursue anything that you love and you think of meaningful, that's when you get your blocks. Mm-hmm. That's the nature of a problem.
Okay.
In philosophical midwifery, you can anticipate whenever you're doing what you truly love and what is meaningful to you, you'll get a block.
In other words, we're coming back to the issue of self-sabotage.
Yes.
Okay.
That's essential in our philosophical midwifery.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, you can anticipate it, you can look forward to it, and now you can ask questions such as, all you have to do is describe the state of mind that you experienced at that moment when that self-sabotage occurred.
Mm-hmm.
Describe it. Then see whether you can look for analogous circumstances to that state of mind, not an association, but a similarity with that state of mind.
Okay.
Look for earlier and earlier events of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's worthwhile, even if you get 4 or 5 as you retreat back into your early life.
Mm-hmm.
Look for the earliest one. Then you'll see it will occur in an event where that's where it began.
Mm-hmm.
And invariably what happens at that time is that you were free, open, alive, finding experience of reality beautiful.
Yeah.
And the imposition comes down upon you, and therefore you give it up. What's interesting, though, is that if you're doing something that is very creative, you'll give up your creativity.
Yeah.
And therefore you suffer that loss, and that produces anger within you. You've been subject to some injustice, and that festers the wound, as it were, and you're angry, but you can't show it. So you look for some other situation where you can then project it upon, and that becomes your life. So midwifery is to try to trace it back, but we go further. We say, now look here, it's important, therefore, for you to tell me what you think is most important to you that you gave up. Go back to it. Go back to your most important challenge. Take it on and let's see how well you can do it and master it.
Mm-hmm.
In that mastery, you'll discover naturally the block that will block you, the self-sabotage will occur.
Mm-hmm.
Then we again ask the same questions. What are they? Can you please put that experience into words? Where are examples of it? You'll find them in several places. You go back to the earliest one. You try to reconstruct that event so you can see the dynamics of it and then relate it to the present.
Mm-hmm.
Midwifery.
It sounds very much like psychotherapy, to be honest.
But why don't they do it?
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of psychotherapy does involve uncovering early childhood trauma.
But they don't link it to such a meaningful event.
Yeah.
They are pursuing anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
We are exploring anger.
Well, and I know in psychotherapy, it's often the term you hear is catharsis. Is like once you get in touch with that anger and express it, the idea is you have had a catharsis and the problem will kind of dissipate.
See, that's true. But you can always find several episodes. The important thing is to find its origin, not to express it. Feeling, by the way, expressing it is very good for the person. They feel good. We want to go to its origin, not to its manifestation.
Yeah.
That's its essential difference.
Do you see the origin as an early childhood trauma or something else?
See, there's never a trauma.
Uh-huh. You don't call it a trauma.
It's not a trauma. In one way, it's not a trauma because there's no punishment. There's no injury inflicted. The parent is seeing a child in an ideal state, and they're imposing a restriction upon it.
Because the parent views the ideal state as this is mischief.
Yes, yes, a potentially mischief, yes, and dangerous to them.
Yeah.
But the state itself is not.
The child
is not a trauma.
Enjoying the mischief.
Yes.
It's wonderful mischief.
Yes. Therefore, it's not a trauma.
But often the parent may discipline the child. I mean, it could be brutal.
Need not be.
Okay.
Need not be at all.
Yeah. But, I mean, in my understanding...
All it has to be is a withdrawal of affection.
Or the parent might simply say, you're a bad person.
Well, yeah, look at the story of the first story I mentioned, of the mother who stood in the doorway and looks beautiful and tells the child, I want you to come home either with your shield or on it. Mm-hmm. She looks beautiful.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily traumatic.
It's not traumatic.
Well, but it could be.
Well, I would say the number of situations that were traumatic are rare.
Oh. Now that's very interesting because, I mean, the conventional view in psychology, I think these days, is that early childhood trauma is far more common than we ever thought, and that almost every psychopathology can be traced to one.
You see, from that event, from the early event, the parent may be so angered at the child repeating these episodes, they may in fact inflict some kind of injury upon the child.
Yeah.
That's not the same thing. That will be an example where the child is angry or in fear. Fear produces anxiety. This is not fear.
Yeah. So you're really not delving much into the area of, let's say, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse by the parent. Mm-hmm. You're looking at something more subtle.
Yes, yes, yes. You see, there are times when I have explored where a child may have gone through some sexual abuse, right? But invariably, what we're looking at is why did the person take advantage of the child?
Yeah.
Because the child appeared to them most beautiful and open, and we have the same dynamic.
I see.
But if I were to make a statement in terms of how many out of how many. Sexual trauma is the child knows what went on. Mm-hmm. They're angry at that. They fear it. They fear its recurrence. Mm-hmm. That's not the same thing as discovering the false belief. Now, why does the child from that event get a false belief? This is very important. So, in the scenes we're talking about where they were doing something that was very beautiful to them, very meaningful to them, they don't understand why the parent suddenly turned against them. They have to walk away saying there must be something wrong with me.
Right.
But they can't believe that their parents are trying to block them from a meaningful experience. They don't have the age and the intelligence yet to make that judgment.
That's
so they blame themselves. That blaming themselves, they characterize themselves in a certain way, is the false image of the self.
And that's what you call the
pathologos.
Pathologos.
Right.
Now, and I love that term, pathologos, because it relates to a term everybody has heard of, the logos.
Yes, yes.
And the logos seems to be practically the opposite of the pathologos.
That's right. The method of analysis, the logos, which is we use the same questions in the same way always. No need to vary it except minor circumstances, but essentially the same questions are always going to be asked, which is what? Same way we've used so far. Say, let's see, you were trying to achieve your goal. Oh, and you were blocked. Can you put that in words? Yes. What was it like? What did you feel at that time?
Careful of your microphone.
Yeah. What did you feel at that time? Oh, you get a description of that. Where did you have that description? Where did you describe that in your past? Oh, you have several events. Let's look at each one. By the way, sooner or later we're going to have to go for the earliest one. Oh, yes, we will. Always the same.
So if I understand you correctly, the logos also in this process, it becomes like the inner wisdom of the person, the kind of, one might say, higher self. It's always there.
It's always there. It's always there. It's remarkable that it's there. And it's remarkable that such understanding can free them of their problem. Wow. Like, realization is the result of coming to grips with something that occurred to you that you didn't understand. Therefore, understanding is primary for your growth. Well, then that means that life is meaningful. That means you cannot block someone's growth without injuring them for the rest of their life. But that's why we should save criminals. That's why we should save these people who are terrorists. We shouldn't say, look here, let's see what made you what you are, so we can then try to understand it. That's reason. That's making a rational life.
But there's also the issue of how we block ourselves.
Whenever we block ourselves, see, that's what we do. Whatever we learn, we apply to ourselves. We become a teacher of ourselves. We become our worst teacher of ourselves because we're imitating a past teacher. I always tell the people I work with, if you don't solve your problem, don't worry, you'll do it to your child.
No problem.
No problem. You'll see you'll be doing it to your child.
And of course, no parent really wants to do that, but the antidote seems to be inner work.
Yes. See, I got the first glimpse of this myself when my first couple of years of marriage. My son Peter was on a tricycle. We lived in San Francisco, and it was one of the one of the walk-ups. And I got home and I was watching him. He didn't see I was home. I was walking up the step, and he's going back and forth on his tricycle over a grate where the hot air came, the heat of the apartment. And I was watching him, and I kept watching him. I didn't know why I was watching him. I saw I was absorbed in it, and I screamed at him. I never screamed at him before. I yelled at him, "What the hell are you doing?" And I didn't know why I was doing it. I carried that for a long, long time, saying, "Hey, Pierre, you don't understand yourself because here's the kid you love, and look what you're doing. You're scaring the hell out of him. What for? He's riding a tricycle over a grate?" See, then later I could see he was really in an ideal state, having a great time, freedom in himself, and I was worried about that state, allowing that state to perpetuate itself and continue, and maybe even deepen. And I wanted to protect him, and I didn't realize any of that was true until another 10, 15 years down the road.
You were trying to protect him from his own best nature.
Yes. Yes, and I carried that
important insight for every parent.
Yes, yes, yes.
Well, Pierre Grimes, once again, a very profound, meaningful time together. I look forward to seeing you often in the future. I know we'll have a lot to talk about.
Very good.
And I'm sure our viewers will appreciate it as well. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.